You're finished with the photographs. Welcome everybody. Welcome to the Hilton Hotel this morning and to the launch of the MABS research report for the few but not the many, an analysis of debt relief notices but from a debtor's perspective. My name is Gwen Harris and I'm the regional manager in North Dublin MABS. The research today is the research today is a testimony to the working group who have been piloting, and Mary Clark in particular, who has been a big organiser of the event today. So thank you, Mary, in case I do forget later on. MABS is celebrating 30 years this year. However, the insolvency legislation in Ireland is only 10 years old. And MABS' involvement in Fresh Start and debt settlement predates the 2012 Personal Insolvency Act, where we worked with what is now the BPFI, what was the Irish Banking Federation, on a debt settlement pilot programme in 2004. And since that time we have been advocating, campaigning and putting forward submissions on personal insolvency, up to the enactment of the Personal Insolvency Act 2012 and since. And we have today, we are presenting the debtor's perspective on the insolvency solution known as a debt relief notice. Today we have three speakers. First we have Fiona Coyne, the CEO of the Citizens Information Board, who funds the MABS service. We also have the two authors of the report, Dr. Stuart and Paul Joyce. So to begin proceedings, I'm delighted to present Fiona Coyne, CEO of Citizens Information Board. Fiona has held several senior management roles in Citizens Information Board, including the overseeing of the restructure of the MABS services and the Citizens Information Services in 2018. Fiona joined CIB in 2014 as a training manager and has previously worked as a director in Carranua and Sport Ireland. Fiona has also worked with a number of government departments, including the Department of Health. So I invite Fiona to open the launch this morning.
Thanks, Gwen. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm a little bit short, so I might move that down. And welcome here to Kilmainham on an absolutely beautiful day. And sorry for giving people a bit of a heart attack. It was so nice. We decided we would take public transport and then walk up, and that was probably not the best thing to do when it was so nice and warm outside. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be here today to launch this important piece of MABS research on debt relief notices. And I was just mentioning to Stuart and Paul earlier on, it's a real pity, I think, that more people don't actually know about debt relief notices, and I really hope that today's report will give an opportunity to make people aware that it is an option for them when they find themselves, in debt. And particular thanks also to Michelle O'Hara, who was talking about the subject this morning on Morning Ireland. And I understand we're going to hear some testimonies from people who've been through the process as well, which I think is really important and very powerful. So I would like to thank the researchers, Dr. Stuart and Paul Joyce, for the excellent report which they've produced. And I'm delighted that this research was able to be supported by a social policy grant from CIB, and Gerald McGarry, our social policy and research manager, is here. And I acknowledge the very hard work that went into this report, into developing the report by the working group, which was made up of representatives of the MABS regional companies. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to Mary Clark for her lead on this event today and quite a lot of correspondence back and forth with my office, so thank you, Mary. So the Citizens Information Board, as you know, is the statutory body responsible for supporting the provision of information, advice and advocacy on social services and for the provision of money advice and budgeting services across the country. The Citizens Information Board has been involved with funding and supporting MABS since 2009 and had a previous role in supporting the training of MABS companies, and Stuart was involved back in that time. So the work of MABS, we understand in CIB, touches every community across the country, from those who are in mortgage arrears and problem debt to those struggling currently in particular with the costs of everyday life, including those who find themselves in vulnerable situations. And this research highlights important points in relation to the operation of the debt relief notice regime, which will have an impact on those accessing the service and attempting to recover from indebtedness. This research analyses the debt relief notice from the debtor's perspective, which I think is really important, that we get to hear people's experience, and you as practitioners working with those people, can give a voice to the difficulties and the challenges. And the research is, as Gwen mentioned in her opening remarks, particularly timely, as 2022 marks the 10th anniversary of the enactment of the Personal Insolvency Act 2012. This act heralded a new era for insolvent debtors in Ireland, introducing 3 new court-backed debt resolution mechanisms for debtors and underpinning in law an insolvent debtor's right to a fresh start. And as those of you who remember the old legislation, becoming insolvent or becoming a bankrupt was certainly something that no one would have voluntarily went into. So following the enactment of the Act, the Minister for Social Protection requested the Board of CIB to provide approved intermediaries through the MABS network to administer the debt relief notices on behalf of the public. And initially 13 money advisors were trained as approved intermediaries and seconded into a dedicated unit, which is referenced in the display behind me, to work on developing the procedures required to deliver DRNs in MABS. Following the development of accredited training facilitated by MABS Support, and I see representatives here from MABS Support, the University of Ulster trained 130 MABS staff as approved intermediaries to provide DRNs. This resulted then in the public being able to access an appointment to discuss eligibility for a debt relief notice in MABS offices across the country. And the Circuit Court granted the first debt relief notice on the 21st of January 2014, and since then almost 2,000 DRNs have been secured. And as well as being at the forefront of supporting the public to access DRNs, MABS have also worked to provide feedback to enhance the operation of the legislation in practice. Over the past decade, qualifying debt amounts, asset values and the value of motor vehicles have all been revised upwards following submissions from MABS. And I'd like to note the representatives here from the ISI, including Michael McNaughton, who we work closely with in relation to those issues. This research report then highlights that with further enhancements to the eligibility criteria, the application process and the supervision period, the scheme could be used even more widely. I'd like to congratulate the MABS regional companies for undertaking this research, which represents a very comprehensive and fully considered overview of 10 years of debt relief notices in Ireland. It highlights that when successful, a DRN can be a truly transformative experience for people. This year, as Gwen also mentioned, marks 30 years since the establishment of MABS, and there will be a series of events to celebrate the work during the year, including a conference in September. But this report clearly shows that you, as MABS staff, continue to demonstrate the same desire to assist and help people with unmanageable debt secure a fresh start as when the service first started operation in 1992. So I'd just like to finish by thanking you all for inviting me here today and commend the work of the staff and the researchers in producing this very important report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you very much to CIB for funding the research and supporting the endeavours of bringing our clients' stories to the fore today. As Fiona's mentioned, one of the objectives of the MABS service lies in policy change. And we endeavour to do this by telling our client's story and the lived experience of policies and processes that exist and impact their daily lives. Today, we're very privileged to be able to hear first-hand personal accounts from a number of people who have gone through the debt relief notice process and the impact that this debt solution and process has had on them and their lives. First, we hear from a single parent with a child of 6 who contacted MABS in relation to a number of debts outstanding, deterioration of a financial situation due to ill health and relationship breakdown. And the total debt outstanding on a debt relief notice was €32,707. So we're going to hear, Carol, if you could.
So before the DRN, what was it like?
Yeah. Okay, so I was working in one of the main banks. I was the senior financial advisor in the branches, and my relationship, how I started with my relationship, the first thing was that myself and my fiance split up, and it kind of rolled on from there. But working in a bank, I had a couple of loans, and probably after about a year, I tried to manage everything. Precious rent, and I was just building more and more debt. Probably small things, but it was rotten Peter's take all, I suppose, and it got quite bad, like the stress of everything. My own personal life, I got fairly sick. It was panic attacks, anxiety. I wasn't sleeping, I was distracted at work, everything. I was seeing a counsellor, and just through my job, I knew about MABS. But I suppose in the beginning, I kind of felt a bit embarrassed, or especially with my role. When you fall into arrears in my role, you have to disclose it, it's ethical and it's monitored by the central bank. So, yeah, it kind of went from there then, from counselling I went to MABS and reached out.
What then, so you knew about MABS beforehand, when you got in touch and you asked about the DRN process, what was the process like?
Yeah, it was that, to be fair, I was very hesitant. I kind of was nervous and embarrassed and, what's going to happen, and I have to say that it really, it's not at all what I kind of thought. It's very personal. I don't know, I dealt with a girl called Clodagh, because I owe her so much, like they made me feel she made me feel so comfortable, and, she was really organised. She really stepped in, made sure she got onto the bank that my big loan was filed with, and they stopped applying interest, which capped everything. It was really very, it was a good experience, it changed everything.
And thinking about your situation now, what impact would you say that it had?
Oh my God, it saved me. It saved probably, my whole life is different. Once I could breathe again, going through it all, I never ever felt embarrassed. Very easy to be open with her and tell her everything, every single thing that was, bills, everything, but I was never felt in any way embarrassed or, it was a very personal thing, but from the moment she got there, she was there, it settled my nerves an awful lot gradually. This is a year ago that it would have gone through. And, one thing at a time, it gave me space to breathe and to think and, reevaluate probably a lot of my life. I could start from scratch. I could build from the foundation up. The only thing would be the supervision period. I'm finding it difficult there. I'd love to go back to work, but it's just not going to be doable for another 2 years for myself. They don't change down the line, and so it's changed everything, honestly. After that, got my house gathered and counselling, and then I got an offer of a house or an apartment, from the council. It kind of it relaxed me. It's changed my whole life, though. It's the relief of, it was the constant calls and worrying about everything, and I just was not going to be able to pay it. There was no way I could manage it on my own with my son and working and rent. It's changed my whole life. Honestly, I'm a different person.
And would you recommend the DRN process to people that need it?
Highly. Anyone who's struggling like that, my only thing is that I didn't maybe go forward a bit quicker. It would have alleviated, how bad it got for me. I would definitely recommend it. If there was anyone ever in the position I was in, or even just struggling, in this day and age, after everything over the last 2 years, I'm sure there's a lot of people that were in my position. And it's all about just getting it out, reaching out, and there's people there to help. It's changed my life. I'd love to go and work some apps now when the time comes, do you know what I mean? Because it really has changed. It's done so much for me,
That's great, thank you, Karen. I think that's a very powerful recording to listen to, and we're very grateful and privileged that the clients did trust us to allow the recording to be played for you today. So that moves us on then to our next speaker this morning, who is no stranger to MABS and probably no stranger to many people in the room, Dr. Stuart Stamp, who is an independent social researcher and a research associate with the Department of Applied Social Studies in Maynooth University. His main interests are personal over-indebtedness and financial exclusion from an inequality and human rights perspective. So I'll welcome Stuart to discuss the report and the findings.
Thanks a million, Gwen. Good morning, everybody. It's a lovely venue, actually, and it's a nice temperature in the room, which is great. It's a bit hot outside. Just a few thanks to start with, and that's a fantastic contribution we've just heard there, really. And people who contributed to the research include a selection of clients, which I think gives a very powerful voice to it. But there are other contributors as well. People contributed data, the Insolvency Service of Ireland, System Information Board, MABS regions, so we got a lot of really good hard data. Qualitatively, we also spoke to stakeholders from those organisations, and also from creditor side of things, from people who support MABS and people who actually sort of, if you like, implement the DRN on a day-to-day basis, MABS staff and approved intermediaries. And also to thank the subgroup who sort of kept us on the straight and narrow and helped us at various times when we were looking for information and data. So it's a real team effort, that's the first thing I want to say. The motivation actually came from the MABS regions themselves, who were looking obviously at the numbers and saying, you know, why are these numbers so low? And more importantly, perhaps what would help, you know, to get more people accessing and using debt relief notices. So that kind of research lends itself very much to a mixed method type approach, where you look obviously the data and the statistics on the one hand, and then you do some qualitative work to try and find people's experiences on the other, and hopefully those two go together, and the qualitative stuff perhaps explains or illuminates some of the things that you're sort of seeing in the data. So what did we find? Well, taking the quantitative stuff first, if you like, the statistics first, two things became apparent from that. First is that the numbers are very low, and they're low in comparison to the debt relief order procedure in the UK, upon which DRNs are modelled at least to some degree. And that's quite interesting in itself, I think. And I know when Paul talks about some of the legislative issues before, he'll certainly touch on how the legislation sort of perhaps plays out in that regard. But certainly the numbers are much lower than you would expect, and indeed relative to official expectations when the Act was implemented 10 years ago. So that's very important. So there's obviously scope to get more people involved, accessing and using debt relief notices. But secondly, when we looked at the numbers that are there, and I'd say very thankful to the data that we were provided with, what started to become apparent was it's a very narrow cohort of people that are actually being approved for debt relief notices. And they tend to be people in single sort of situations, single adults, single households, fixed income situations, with relatively few prospects of things improving in the foreseeable future. So that's quite a narrow sort of base, if you like. And what was also noticeable was there were relatively few couples in the database, relatively few people in work, and relatively few younger people. So that says to us that as the architecture as it's developed, it's certainly, you know, encouraging one group of people to go through the process and become approved, but maybe sort of militating against another group, which sort of is that group I've just mentioned. So there's plenty of opportunity and scope, we think, for more access, to broaden the net, if you will. So that's the quantitative data, but of course that only takes us so far. So then looking at the qualitative side of things, if you, in a sense, to try and answer the why, there's sort of 5 things that came through there, and just very, very briefly I'll touch on each of them. First, as was mentioned before by Gwen, is Fiona, is the eligibility situation, the eligibility rules, which are sort of precluding many people on income grounds, on asset grounds. A lot of issues around motor vehicles in particular came up in the research. And perhaps most importantly, the preference issue, that a lot of people were being sort of excluded, if you like, from embarking on the process because they had expressed or allegedly made a preference to a creditor in the preceding period. And these were people who were just doing what maybe anybody would do. They were responding to the creditor who shouted loudest, who put the most pressure on. They were actually in many cases doing what the money advice process advises them to do. You see it on the board behind here, which is prioritise debts. So if you're prioritising debts, you're in a sense, exercising a preference. And also the people who need credit, people on very, very sort of marginal incomes, very, very finely balanced budgets, may need credit from time to time. So that can mean that they prioritise maybe the credit union or whichever body provides them with access to that credit. So there's a lot of eligibility rules that we think could be addressed to make more people, bring more people within the pool for debt relief notices. The second sort of set of explanations, if you like, relates to the process requirements, which most people tend to find complex, daunting, and quite onerous. Most of you in this room know what these requirements are, and they do, they are quite, difficult for people to engage with and go through, unless they have the support of a MABS member of staff and the approved intermediary. And that was one of the big findings of the research, that the people who went through it tended to be people who at least had the capability to be supported. I hope that makes sense. People have to be able to be supported, and many people are just not in that space for various reasons. And one of the things we found was that amongst the regions, roughly 2/3 of people who considered or thought about the debt relief process actually didn't go through with it. And only in a third of those cases was eligibility the reason. In the other 2/3, it was really because it just didn't fit with how people needed to live and manage their lives in terms of access to credit and the uncertainties and so on that are in people's lives, particularly when you're living on the margins in terms of income. So that's eligibility and process. And then the third sort of set of findings relates to supervision. And here the supervision period, 3 years, the general consensus is that's too long. The debt relief order procedure in the UK, as many of you will know, is actually 1 year. And interestingly, as part of the research, we spoke to an approved intermediary in the UK, and I said, what do you think about the supervision period? And they said, we don't call it a supervision period, we call it a moratorium period. That's quite a different way of thinking about it. I think that's quite an important distinction. We might come back to that later on. But that period, it's very long, and a lot of things can happen, and people have to weigh up an awful lot of sort of possibilities and variables. Will my situation improve? Is my income likely to go up? May I come into lump sum, whatever it is? I'm going to need credit. How am I going to access that during the period? A whole lot of different things. And so, that's one of the recommendations we make, is to shorten that supervision period and line it up with the UK. The fourth thing we found was the lack of awareness point, and I think Fiona mentioned that at the start. It's interesting, the people we spoke with who'd gone through the whole process and been approved, all of them said the same thing. None of them knew about it until they actually linked in with MABS. And it was only when they were linked in with MABS that option started to become explained to them and available to them. So there's a lot of work, obviously, that needs to be done to make people more aware of the fact that there are these, this debt relief option is there for them. And the final sort of finding really relates to financial exclusion. And this is a very important issue and area that sort of dropped off the policy agenda a little bit. I think it's coming back on again now. But this is the whole issue of access to financial services, and particularly credit, and in particular affordable credit. And this was a big issue for people, both whether or not to go through with the debt relief process, or the debt relief notice process itself, and also at the end of it. Because what obviously DRNs are doing is they're discharging people from debt, but they're not necessarily making access to financial services available at the end of it. And we found that some people can still find themselves precluded from accessing mainstream financial services suitable to their needs, including credit. So, so financial exclusion is something we need to think about in this area as well. It's a very important issue. So there are a bunch of problems, if you like, and issues and how we might resolve them. But I think the big message we want to get across really is a positive one, that DRNs can be transformative for people. And we heard that in that wonderful testimony just a few minutes ago. And that's huge. That came out of the research in big, bold letters, capital letters, and that transformative nature. But it's important here to think where people were at beforehand. Debt, chronic debt, can be debilitating to people. It can actually stop them living their lives. It can stop them getting on with their lives. It can be stressful every day, almost every hour of the day. So that's the context for this. And you could see people who had been suffering both personally, in terms of their household, in terms of relationships, in terms of social activities and so on. people who've been really, really struggling, you can imagine the relief that is felt when you're actually free of all of that. And people report an increased well-being, confidence, freedom from stress, and perhaps most importantly, we heard it in the clip there, life chances, the chance to get on. It's what sociologists refer to as a life chance, the chance to get on with your life and start again and build again. So that's a really hugely positive message, I think, that we want to take everybody to take away today. But just the importance is to make it more accessible, usable, and make sure people are aware of it. They're the big three things we think need to happen. So just to wrap up, just a few general lessons, just to share just a few thoughts just for a minute. And the first one is that there's often this debate in academia between, schemes, welfare schemes, options, between generosity on the one hand and harshness on the other hand. Okay, so do we make our schemes, do we err towards the generous side, to be inclusive, to try and get people to access them and use them and engage with them? Or do they sometimes act on a harsher scale, almost to preclude and prevent people from accessing and using them? And the trick is to try and recalibrate or calibrate interventions such as DRN in a way that isn't harsh, but is also, generous in the sense that it actually encourages people to engage with it. I suppose that's another one of our messages here. We think just there's a need to recalibrate the way we sort of think about debt relief notices and indeed other personal insolvency and over-indebtedness interventions to make sure they're more inclusive and generous for people because of the very nature of over-indebtedness itself. That's the key. People who are over-indebted are in really bad places in many cases. So the scheme needs, if you like, to be progressive. It needs to be weighted more towards the generous side because that's where people are at. People are in very, very difficult situations to start with. The second lesson is we need to talk to people more. We need to talk to users more, service users, and find out their experiences. We did that to some degree in the report. It's fantastic today to know that we're hearing from other people who we didn't interview as part of the study, but are sharing their experiences. I think we need to do that much more often. And I'd say the two things that came out of this, for us anyway, one is the transformative nature of DRNs, just how transformative they could be. But secondly, was how much people depended on the heavy lifting, if you like, the huge intensive support that was being provided by MABS staff to get them through and over the line. So the third lesson is I think we need to be a bit more dynamic. We need to change more quickly as it becomes apparent that things maybe aren't working or things need to change or be tweaked. And a good example here is obviously the current climate we're in. Things are changing almost by the day, certainly by the week. So income and expenses and things like that are changing hugely. So we need somehow to build in, a way of responding to be more dynamic, if you like, to change as it happens for people's lives. So that's the third lesson. And the fourth one and the final one, I'm just going to leave you with this, if I may, is we often think about debt as an economic, a business, a finance issue. That's where you see it often in the media. It's buried in the business pages or in the economics analysis or whatever it is. I think one of the things this study shows, and indeed many others over the years, is that debt is really more of a welfare or a well-being issue. And we need to think about it more in those terms, because that's how it plays out in people's lives, in people's households, with people's relationships. So I think we need to think about the whole area much more, as I say, as a welfare, a well-being issue, and in doing so to respond accordingly to people's needs and the difficulties that people are in. So that's it. I'm going to get off the stage now and hand back to Gwen. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. A lot of food for thought there for everybody. Now we move back to listening to another debtor's experience on a clip. This time we move to a 35-year-old gentleman who has 2 children, and this fits nicely into Stuart's final comment there about well-being when we hear his story. Very often as practitioners, when we meet with clients, they would want to pay their debts. This is the story that they say when we talk about a debt relief notice. They don't want to proceed because they want to pay their debts. And this gentleman talks about he took his second job, working 80 hours a week, but could not sustain it, returned to MABS, and this is his story and his experience of a debt relief notice.
Can you tell me what was it like before you went through the DRN process?
It was immense pressure. late nights, early mornings, waking up wondering where the money's going to come from to pay the debts off. Stressful, even with the kids, not paying attention to them when they're talking to you, because you're just so absorbed in where the next few bobs come from to pay the next bill, pay for the shopping. You know, what do you sacrifice? All that. So it was a tough time.
What encouraged you to come for DRN, to look for the process?
Well, I knew I couldn't manage on my own, so I started googling stuff. What could I do with the help out there? And I came across the MABS and made a phone call. So after that, it was encouraging.
And what about the process itself? How did you find the DRN process as you were going through it?
It was easy from the first phone call I made to the lady that was in charge, Fiona. She kind of took the pressure from the first phone call and reassured me that everything was going to be alright and that they would deal with everything in hand, and I just come in, sign some forms and be aware. She kept me in the loop of what was going on. It was great. It was immediately took the weight off my shoulder.
Now that you've gone through the process, what would you say is the biggest impact that it's had on your life?
Relief, happiness, you know, it's the dark clouds are gone. So yeah, it's big impact. Kids are happier as well, spending more time with them, you know, so that's it.
And what would you recommend the DRN process then to other people?
Definitely I'd recommend it to anyone that was in the same situation. Like if anyone has 1, 2, 3 loans paying out, go to MABS and get help, or you know, if you can't get all in one.
I think that's an extremely powerful message to hear, the impact that living with debt has on our children and our relationships, and something that Stuart had mentioned earlier on. So we move to our final speaker this morning, Paul Joyce, who is a senior policy analyst with the Free Legal Advice Centres, known as FLAC. He's the author of both the FLAC's major reports on debt and the legal systems in Ireland, and then based on Means, published in 2003, and To No One's Credit, published in 2009. He also authored a number of policy reports and submissions. Paul, I invite you to... Sorry, Paul.
Thanks very much, Gwen. Good morning to everyone. Nice to be at a live event where you can see people's faces. And nice to see so many friendly faces out there, people with whom we've worked over the years, who are still at the cold face of money advice work. I only helped to write the report. I didn't learn it off, so when I start talking about proposed legislative changes, I'll be reading a bit from the text here. Just want to start off with just a quote from the report. It's on page 17, but I think it's particularly important in the context of where we're living and where we're heading now. It says, personal debt problems emerge in the main as a result of things that happen to people, rather than things that are done by people, and particularly so in the case of those who are in precarious or marginalised situations to begin with. Common examples here are what we call force majeure, or external or unforeseeable events, such as the ones you all know: unemployment, redundancy, small business failure, decreases in income, cost of living increases, illness, disability, relationship breakdown. And they're the things that happen to people that change their lives and lead to insolvency and incapacity to meet the terms of credit agreements. One further example that's just hit us in the last couple of years, it's the absolute essence of a force majeure event, is the pandemic. And as we speak, that's playing out for an awful lot of people in terms of the aftermath of COVID and other adverse external events that have subsequently occurred. Russian invasion, of Ukraine, so-called supply chain issues, energy, fuel and food inflation, the prospect now of significant interest rate spikes, we don't know where that's going, the ever key issue of climate change, and it hasn't gone away, consequences of Brexit, which are still playing out and important not to forget. Now, I've left out in that list price gouging, because as you know, that doesn't happen in Ireland. All of these events impact very significantly on the capacity of borrowers of money, tenants who have rental obligations, consumers of utilities, and interestingly enough, there were 2020 figures on utilities, but they've kind of run dry. Apparently, the CRU doesn't have the resources to continue to provide figures, but anybody who saw figures in 20 and 2021 will see how many domestic accounts on electricity and gas are in trouble as we speak, which is a really important indicator of financial difficulty. So this is where the debt relief notice comes into its own, or should come into its own. The situation we're in now, and the situation we appear to be facing, the debt relief notice is an antidote to a lot of these financial problems. Because it provides a structured mechanism for low income, low asset debtors to have their debts written off and to be returned to insolvency. As you know, debt's back on the agenda, it's back in the media. Anybody who heard Morning Ireland this morning, well done Michelle, by the way, for the piece on debt relief notices. But even at last weekend, there was a lot of talk of the capacity to service credit agreements in light of the inflation problem and the threat of recession and so on. Kieran McQuinn from the Economic and Social Research Institute said this morning on Morning Ireland that high inflation is impacting most on persons with low incomes. And he went on to say that the government can take a targeted approach to alleviating this. The debt relief notice is a way of alleviating the financial insolvency at a low debt level that people are facing. The research question that we asked in this research is, why have applications and completed DRNs not been more numerous? And what would improve access, workability, and meaningful completion from a MABS client-debtor perspective? Nothing that I can say here will reach the eloquence of the testimonies that Carl has played there. What's extraordinary about it to me, particularly the second one, the gentleman, you could hear him reliving his problem, the problems that he had. There was a sort of a relief but also tension in his voice. And the interviews that Stuart carried out, very sensitively as always, really got to the heart, I think, of people's experience, the pain and suffering involved in being insolvent and then finding a way out of that insolvency. And it's great tribute to approved intermediaries, many of whom are in the room, money advisors who assisted in setting up appointments with approved intermediaries for DRNs to be looked at. The effort in MABS to deal with this problem is colossal. Therefore, the report does suggest a number of improvements or reforms to the DRN that might boost the numbers. As we know, it's less than 2,000 since 2013, approximately 8 times less than DROs in the UK. So I don't know how much time I have here, and when you'll stop me, I'm sure. But just to touch on a few of these, where did the proposals come from in the first place? It came from the work of the Law Reform Commission. Those of you who go back that far will remember that the Law Reform Commission conducted a lengthy consultation exercise, and in a 2010 report, Personal Debt Management and Debt Enforcement made a number of recommendations in the debt and insolvency space. In terms of the debt relief notice, just going to go through a few of their recommendations that didn't make it into the final piece of legislation. The first was that they recommended a 1-year supervision stroke discharge period. So that was recommended back in 2010. And they recommended it because it corresponded with the debt relief notice moratorium, as Stuart explained it, period of 1 year in the UK. 3 years is a very long time to wait for a discharge from your debt. People get very anxious and worried and demotivated in many situations during such a lengthy period, and creates poverty traps that really are best avoided. So again, that's a core recommendation, is to decrease the length of the supervision period. The Law Reform Commission also recommended that the process should be purely administrative in nature. And that involved, you might recall, they proposed the creation of a debt settlement office in their report, also known as the Insolvency Service of Ireland, same idea. Okay. The Commission recommended that a court should only be involved if a creditor objected to the making of such an order, or if the office, Debt Settlement Office, or ISI in this case, deems the intervention of the court to be necessary. We've heard in the testimony of people that people found the process quite bureaucratic, an awful lot of forms and appointments and so on. We don't think, but there are legal questions about this, we don't think a court has to really make these declarations. There should be access to a court in the event of objections, but otherwise it's an administrative process which we think the ISI could do itself with a right of reference into the courts. Another recommendation they made was that money advice and debt counselling should be provided to debtors before and during the process to aid rehabilitation. And this is maybe an important factor to remember. We got the sense to a certain extent that once the DRN application is made and approved, that there isn't sometimes a follow-up service during the discharge period to the extent that might be necessary to help people rehabilitate properly, to look at income maximisation issues, to look at other issues that might improve the person's life post-DRN. A further recommendation then was a provision to enable re-access after 6 years. In other words, that once 6 years had elapsed, that you could potentially apply for a second debt relief notice if the circumstances and your situation fulfilled the requirements. As it is, you can only have one DRN for life. Now, of course, who wants a second DRN? But things can happen to people, as you know better than I do, that can lead to a second insolvency through no fault of the person themselves. Just a question of circumstances. Could be 10 years, 20 years down the line. And maybe that's something also that needs to be looked at, the possibility of a second debt relief notice. Now, on the question of preferences, which Stuart has referred to, the Law Reform Commission report said that any creditor stroke preferential treatment provision should take into account the fact that many debtors seeking to avail of this procedure may be quite vulnerable likely to become subject to considerable pressure from certain creditors and may, as a consequence, prefer one creditor over others. Very important observation and understanding of the problems that people on low incomes have in terms of access to credit. And again, you all know better than me that a lot of people, their only credit option is either a licensed money lender or, more commonly, the credit union. And people are pressurised to make payments. And as Stuart very pertinently observed earlier on, MABS practice itself is to advise people to prioritise their utility debts so they won't get cut off, to make sure that they preserve whatever credit options they have, and so on. Now this is kind of technical, but the preference rule, you give a preference, the debtor gives a preference to a creditor if that debtor does anything, including the granting of security, or suffers anything to be done that has the effect of substantially reducing the amount available to the debtor for the payment of his or her debts. Intent is not covered by that definition. You could do this accidentally without being aware that you've actually given a preference. So without, again, going on too long on this, we did make a recommendation that that the preference issue should only apply where a debtor has deliberately given a preference to a person that has had the intended effect of substantially reducing the amount available to the debtor for the payment of his or her debts. One other further issue here on preference, by the way, I mean, the feedback from a lot of approved intermediaries was that the preference issue they found very difficult to address, that it was very tricky, and perhaps a detailed protocol between the ISI and MABS approved intermediaries on this and other issues, working very closely together in these kind of situations of doubt or where an interpretation is needed and so on. If it doesn't exist at present, or doesn't exist to the extent that perhaps it should, maybe that's something that really needs to be looked at, that the ISI and MABS approved intermediaries work together to iron out these particular kinks. Stuart mentioned earlier on that our reading was that most DRNs are single people. If you're a hay fever sufferer like me, by the way, it's a disaster at the moment. The pollen count is enormous, so anybody who's got hay fever, I really sympathise. Okay, so what we're basically proposing, because of the low number of couples, families, that can access a DRN successfully, is that there be created a thing called a household debt relief notice. The issue highlighted by MAB staff, and this is also highlighted by some external respondents, including creditors, it was pointed out by a number of people that deciding who pays what can be a difficult exercise and an unrealistic one, in that the end result may be bear little reality to how money is actually managed week by week within a low-income household. And we think that these difficulties has led to a skew in the numbers towards single adult household approvals. One creditor said, we would welcome some clarity on the process where one half of a couple get a DRN and financial liabilities are in both names. A very interesting and pertinent question. Anyway, so what we're suggesting is that maybe a household DRN be provided for, where you might increase the threshold from €35,000 to perhaps €50,000, and that the qualifying debts of both partners in the household would be taken into account, and at the conclusion of the supervision period, that the qualifying debts of the household should be written off. rather than just one individual. Now, we appreciate that from a mechanic's point of view, and that would take some doing, but the feedback we're getting is that the rules around reasonable living expenses, how you allocate those to different people, who's responsible for what. As you know, a lot of people have, along with the credit union, one person's the borrower, the partner is the guarantor, and vice versa. So there really has to be a mechanism where the collective debts of the household can be effectively taken into account. Now, I could rattle on for ages, but I don't intend to. We're just looking at other things. The insolvency test. The insolvency test, the applicant must have no likelihood of becoming solvent within 3 years. Well, you'll need some crystal ball as an approved intermediary to actually be able to say that. So again, perhaps something like, it is unlikely that the debtor will become solvent within 3 years, might make it easier for approved intermediaries to deal with that particular issue. Stuart mentioned the vehicle. Now, the vehicle issue is a real difficulty, and if you look at it realistically, it really discriminates against a person in favour of a person who owns their own car, and against someone who has a car on credit. Now, you might seek to bring the credit agreement to an end and sell the car, but then you might be accused of a preference in bringing that agreement to an end and paying off the loan as best you can. Even if you manage to do that, then you've got no car. If you're living in a rural area and you've got a partner and children and so on, you're talking about a 3-year period where effectively you're going to be economically excluded, potentially. Don't have a firm proposal on this, but something needs to be done around the vehicle issue. And obviously the increase in the value of second-hand cars should lead to something being done about the 5,000 threshold. I have a couple of other things, but I think that's enough for everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think one of the principles, the underlying principle of any insolvency is to return people to a fresh economic health and give them a fresh start. And I think Paul has outlined the changes that we do need to make in our legislation to provide that fresh start for everybody. We're just going to listen to one final testimony from a debtor who is in late 60s, and she's a person who secured her DRN very early in 2014. So she has had time to, she's going to explain to us how her life has changed since 2014.
Tell me what life was like before you accessed a DRN.
Okay, well, I'm a disabled person, and in 2010, my condition was disimproving, and I knew that I had to consider either changing my position as what I was working as, or leave my employment. And in the meantime, my debts were building up, and I decided for health reasons, I had to leave my job. And I felt really guilty, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. I knew about MABS, but I wasn't really sure how they would help me. I went to MABS then. The amount that I owed was over 20,000, or just under 20,000. But I was so ashamed of it. I didn't know what to do or where to go, and couldn't contact my debtors because I was feeling really terrible about it. But I knew I had to do something fast, otherwise I was going to end up in court, and I didn't want that to happen either. So it was very, very stressful.
Can you tell me what the DRN process was like for you?
The DRN process was brilliant. First of all, I went to MABS, and they told me about DRN. And the process was, well, what they did was they eliminated all the guilt that I had by the approach they took. And they said, maybe this is the DRN could be the best role that you could go on. And they immediately contacted my debtors, and that put a stop to letters, which was great. They explained everything about the DRN, you know, what I could, what I couldn't do, how long it would last for, what the process was, and that really helped. You know, and I felt that my mental health was really getting to me at that stage. And I felt much more comfortable. I felt, yeah, God, well, this is the road that I should go on. They were very patient with me. I find it difficult because I have intellectual disability as well. So I think they had to explain it and explain it and explain it. And as long as, and they made sure I understood every step of the process. And they were with me every step of the process. So it was really easy. The people that I met along the way were really calm, you know, and didn't take on my stress. And this, which made me calmer, because I needed to get rid of my debt, because my mental health was deteriorating at a pace that I was really kind of I wasn't suicidal, but I'd say I was going down that road. That wasn't going to be good for me, so I needed to do something, and something fast. So they were brilliant. The process was brilliant. It was easy. It was understanding, and there was a lot of empathy, which I really appreciated.
And now that you're at the other side of a DRN, what impact did getting a DRN have on your life?
It made a huge impact. It got me back into, in order for me to get well, I had to ensure that I didn't get into debt again. Now I'm in a really good place. I've applied for loans now with my credit union, which is great. There's no question, like, you know, are you in debt at the moment? There's no embarrassment to it. I've been credited with everything to do with, like, television, ESB, gas, my credit union, savings built up. And it just taught me a way of dealing with my money better. And I have to say, MABS really helped. They really showed me a better way of doing it. And I'm in really good health now at the moment. I was about minding myself in that process. You know, and not be guilty of, like, if I buy presents, you know, for somebody's birthday and stuff like that. And they showed me how I could do it, and how I could do it easily without pain. And only for them, I'm telling you, it was just wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. Wonderful. And that guilt just went right out the window. I have no guilt whatsoever now, none. And I would recommend, if a friend of mine came to me and they said, we're in this debt, go to MABS. So it was really good. And really accessible, and that was really important to me as well. Accessible as a building and accessible as a language. And any complicated words, like, they sat down and explained it to me, and it was just great. It was a really positive experience, really positive.
I'm not too sure how many people would describe their experience of going through living with debt as positive, but I think you'll all agree that that was a very uplifting testimonial to leave us on today. We all work in the space of debt and over-indebtedness, but none of us work alone. And I think it's important that MABS today has brought forward the debtor's voice. Thanks to Paul and Stuart for collating the information and presenting it very clearly and clearly outlined recommendations for change. And we really hope that from today, the report will help influence some changes and make a debt relief notice more accessible to more people. So that concludes the event this morning. I can take off my MC training wheels, and I think I'll leave them to the side. I don't think I've got my license, but anyway, I do apologise. So thanks again to everybody for coming today. Thank you again to the working group who kept, as Stuart said, kept them on track, but who kept pushing this agenda forward and who helped us bring our clients and debtor stories to today. And thank you to Bobby. Bobby Barber, not here today, but he helped us to record and present the testimonials, which I do hope everybody has enjoyed. From a practitioner and money advisor's perspective, we meet with people every day who describe shame and guilt all the time as the reason that they have not reached out to look for help and support. So it is a privilege for us to be able to let everybody else in the room hear those stories and hear how real that is for people living with debt. And we really hope that together we might change and influence powers that be to help us take away some of that shame and guilt. So thanks very much to everybody, and the report is there. We will have it in electronic copy as well, so thank you very much.